So, Tristan, what do you believe is some of the major barriers to early childhood educators incorporating First Nations curriculum and perspectives into the curriculum?
Well, yeah, speaking about the curriculum, I mean, think about, the questions asked before about my own education in turn, going to school and stuff. They're not teaching it in high schools to start with. They're not teaching it in mainstream schools. So I would say a big barrier for early childhood educators would be a lack of their own education on the subject, yeah, or even the confidence to teach the subject. I'm aware that this is difficult for non-Indigenous teachers to feel confident speaking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives when they don't have enough information to start with. They haven't sought the information, or it just hasn't been taught to them. Maybe sometimes out of guilt or fear, they did not have the correct or most up-to-date information. So, yeah, they need to find the information. Information can be quite difficult if you don't know where to look.
So what are some barriers that early childhood educators might have if they're teaching Aboriginal kids?
Yep. I think this is quite similar to the previous question in terms of education. Yeah. Like, if you don't know, you don't know. But if you're not aware of what this young person may have been experiencing, trends generally, or even experiences at home, they might find that quite challenging. Although, depending on the age of the child too, some barriers. So, okay, in an Aboriginal household, this is not all, but this does happen. This child might be very young, but he might still be seen as the man of the house. You know what I mean? He's doesn't matter if there's other adults there in his household. When he's at home, he's the man and he has responsibilities. And a lot of those responsibilities are taking care of his family. It could just be simply he's expected to go down the street and get groceries for his household. He's got a lot more responsibilities than a lot of other children in his class might not have. So then a barrier right there is he comes back into your classroom and you start speaking to him like a little kid, and he might absolutely struggle with that. There might be a real barrier to that, and you might not get through to him. You might just look down and not want to be talked to like a child. Same with the not looking. They might not look at you too. You might struggle with that, and you're thinking the child's being disrespectful. But in a lot of Aboriginal families and a lot of Aboriginal culture, when somebody of power, such as the teacher or an educator, is teaching that child, when an educator or somebody of power is talking to you, you look down. It's not out of disrespect, it's out of respect. And if you don't know these things, you might struggle to engage with that child.
What are some of the ways in which early childhood educators can start their journey of learning?
Yeah. I would consider focusing on on their own learning to build their confidence. As mentioned before, visiting gathering places, actually approaching aunties and uncles and community members, and ask about their stories, get advice, learn. Do their own absolutely do the cultural appreciation training. You know what I mean? It's absolutely vital for every professional to get cultural awareness training. And I'm so worried that many early childhood educators, it isn't made mandatory. I remember when I was doing it, you'd waltz on in, you'd care for the kids, and there was no professional training. So you don't know. So focus on your own learning, be curious, ask questions, keep learning, you'll build confidence. Yeah. And that's what we got to do. Just start, speak to someone, visit a co-op, we're friendly. Okay.
Like being Aboriginal, people presume that you know everything about everything that's Aboriginal.
Yeah.
That's probably not a true reflection of the reality, is it?
No, not at all. You know, I'm always learning. Yeah. Something I've learned, like I can actually bring away from my course, is this term called cultural humility. Now, cultural humility is all about being humble and wanting to learn about cultures that you don't know about. And like, look, Aboriginal people are so diverse. We're talking about a nation of hundreds of countries. You know, language groups, land rights, like land barriers, like just down here in where I am, Wurundjeri land, or the Kulin Nation. You know, there's 5 different countries. Like, it's it's so diverse. And I'm not from here. Being I'm an Aboriginal man, and I've said it before. I'm from New South Wales. You know what I mean? I'm on Wurundjeri country as a Wiradjuri person. My family and my people's customs and the way they do things, right down to the painting or hunting, any of it. You know what I mean? Get rid of the stereotypes. It's different. It's different to what we do down here. You know, we share a common connection to our land and the concept of our ancestors and our feelings, but it's different and it's so diverse. So I'm here as a visitor on this country. I've been in Melbourne. I've been in Wurundjeri land for 10 years, but I'm always learning, and I'll always be a visitor. You know what I mean? I'm still every professional meeting I'm at, I'm still doing an acknowledgement to country. You know, I'm still learning every single day. So yeah, it's incredibly important to continue learning. And even from a perspective as an Aboriginal man, you know, I don't know everything and I don't pretend to know everything. And it can be a real pain when people like to think, oh, look, he's Aboriginal, I'll ask him about something. I may not know. Most of the time I won't know, you know, because it's so diverse.
AJ, what do you believe are the major barriers to early childhood educators incorporating First Nations perspectives into curriculum?
I do think sometimes that educators are really scared to implement anything. They don't want to get it wrong. And they don't want to be offensive either. So instead of trying something, they end up not trying anything. And I think the best thing to do is actually try. It's okay to try and have it not work, but that will give you some ideas about what you might want to try again in the future. But not trying is the major issue. I think one of the other issues is that you need to do a little bit of research before you try to implement stuff. Has it been evidence-based before? Have you actually had Aboriginal people suggest something to you? Because that's a really good start. You know, that there are social media platforms. I know that there's Jessica Steins is a New South Wales-based Aboriginal educator. And she's got workshops and she provides real practical strategies that you can actually work in the classroom. You know, because she's actually tried them and they've worked, they're things that I would actually try. But it doesn't just you don't want to also be trying things and being tokenistic about it as well. You know, like there's no point going, look, we need to introduce some mathematics to little kids. So what we're going to do is go things like Johnny's got 2 boomerangs and Peter's got 4 boomerangs. How many boomerangs are there now? Because that could be tokenistic. Or, you know, helping kids cook and go, look, let's just put lemon myrtle in everything and stir. Oops, now we've got an Indigenous dish. Because that's the tokenistic part. It's about actually sharing the story about why you're actually doing something. And what's the benefit do you get out of making this thing? You know, our Aboriginal people work on these dreamtime stories that tell us how the world was created and how we're supposed to live in it now. So Aboriginal kids learn that way, you know, in this concept-y kind of thing, how the world was created, how do I live in it now? So when you teach Aboriginal kids, it's about how does this actually work, but what do I get out of it now? And it's so important to kind of get those 2 things together before you try actually implementing something.
Following on from that, what do you think are the barriers with early childhood educators teaching Aboriginal children?
Sometimes it's around the inclusive of language as well. You know, we talk a bit about, you know, what do we call kids, you know, Aboriginal, First Nations, Koori. But you kind of need to have a bit of an understanding of what those words actually mean, and in some cases how offensive they might be. The term Koori is quite interesting because Koori kind of means Southeastern Australian, and not all Aboriginal kids that turn up to your service will actually be of Koori descent. Now, Koori, as I said, is a collective term, so and it kind of means Southeastern Australian. I grew up in Sydney. I was a Koori kid growing up, so it was kind of Southeastern Australian. But people just think it's Victorian, and if you just think it's Victorian, and you actually go to a kid, oh, so you're a Koori kid, and they're going, nah, I'm from Queensland. I'm a Murray. Murray is actually the term that's equivalent to Koori. So you can understand then why it might be offensive if you just make that presumption. First Nations is an interesting term, but some of the elders don't like it at all, because when did all of a sudden we become the First Nations people? First Nations people, when I grew up, were the New Zealand Maoris, and they were also the First Nations people of Canada. We were never called First Nations people. It's like a government wave has just come through and changed our narrative. So Aboriginal people weren't consulted really about, would you now like to be called First Nations people? It was a government intervention. A bit like a number of years ago when all of a sudden we couldn't use the term Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we had to call everyone Indigenous. And now we're told not to call everybody Indigenous. And, you know, NACCHO, the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, says you should only use Indigenous when you're talking in the collective, you know, like the Indigenous population or the Indigenous clients or the Indigenous students, but never refer to an individual as being Indigenous. So it's kind of important to understand what the terms mean, how they're used, and again, how they can cause offence. I think the most important thing is to work with a family about how they prefer to be called. You know, some Aboriginal people don't even like the term Aboriginal. Aboriginal is a white man's term. When I identify myself, I don't always identify as being Aboriginal. I identify by being Wiradjuri and Watchabullet, because I talk about the language groups that I actually come from. So it's about understanding those kind of concepts of the, especially around identification, because if you get the identification right, and you do ask every kid that comes into a service, do you identify as being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander? And if the kid says yes, then do a little bit of research. Ask them the next question. So which language group do you guys identify with? And if they say things like Yorta or Wiradjuri, go and do a bit of research, Google search it. Find out where some of the neighbouring communities are. Because next time you get a kid that comes in and says, you know, look, I'm a Wiradjuri, you can actually go, oh, yeah, that's right near Kilmillaroy, and that's right near. And it's showing the families that you've got a really good understanding, even if you don't, but to show them you've got a bit of understanding about the differences of Aboriginal communities across Australia.
What are some of the ways in which early childhood educators could start this journey?
It's not going to come to you. You have to be proactive. You need to do the research. You need to go out and meet people. You need to go and be seen in community. You know, you might want us to start off getting out there during NAIDOC week or Reconciliation week. But outside of that, there's many other opportunities. There are a lot of the gathering places actually have festivals and markets that you can make an appearance. If you're an early childhood educator, the thing that you might want to do is actually create a little stand and go to those markets and actually sit there and talk to community members. Let them know what you do and how you do it. Invite them in to actually see what the service is like. You know, make sure that the service does feel culturally appropriate. Do you actually have the acknowledgement up? Do you actually have the Aboriginal flags flying? But if you do actually have the Aboriginal flags flying, make sure that every staff member, every educator, every person that walks through those front doors knows what those flags mean. Because if you don't, and they don't know what it means, then what you've done is created a very tokenistic gesture. You've said that we put these flags up because we want Aboriginal people to feel supported. But if I find out that staff don't know exactly what the flags mean, then how supported do I actually feel? That's when we talk about tokenism. You know, that if you want to do a welcome to country, for example, get an elder to come in and do it. If you want to do an acknowledgement of country, start with something very simple. Something like, you know, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I currently live on. I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And once you get that and it rolls off your tongue, then you can play around with it and make as creative as you like. You know, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I currently live, work, and play on. The people of the Wurundjeri. I pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge that the land was never ceded. See how I can play around with it once I've actually got the basic. But then again, it's also about learning to say the acknowledgement from the heart. Because as soon as you start reading it, again, it can look very tokenistic to Aboriginal people and Aboriginal families that actually come, because we want to actually hear people acknowledged from the heart, not from the paper. So, Kerry, what are some barriers that non-Indigenous educators might struggle with when trying to incorporate First Nations perspectives into curriculum?
One thing is that they don't want to seem tokenistic, so therefore they don't do it at all. Some don't know where to start and who the right person is to ask. Where I work, in the space that I work, I'm happy for people to start off being tokenistic, and then the next year they add a little bit more, they add a little bit more, they add a little bit more, and then it's moving away from that tokenism into the embedding of the perspectives and the cultural aspects of it. So I think there's a lot of confusion about Aboriginal perspectives versus Aboriginal culture and what they can teach and what they can't teach. And that gets really confusing. So people just say, look, I don't want to do it. A lot of people are scared that they might offend. So again, they don't want to step on toes. They don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to have elders coming in growling at them. So therefore they just don't do it. You are going to make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes. You learn from those mistakes the way we do in any aspect of life.
Yeah. What are some barriers that early childhood educators might experience when they're working with Aboriginal kids in the room? Or to their
some of our families don't know their Aboriginal connection to either where they are or where they're from. And some of that can come down to people just didn't want to identify as being Aboriginal. The stolen generation has impacted that as well. So they're relying on those families to be that conduit to all of the Aboriginal connection that they have within services. And when families come to them and just say, look, I'm sorry, we don't know, they don't know what to do next. They don't know that next step. So that's where, people in my job, career engagement support officers, we come in handy. We're there to advise and steer people in the right direction. We are happy to give resources to help services start that process.
Yeah. What are some ways in which early childhood educators could start their journey in terms of trying to understand history and getting the barrier and looking at identifying what the barriers are and making changes?
Even just starting off, finding out where your service is built and who were the traditional owners. That in itself is a huge step, because then you're starting to put the puzzle pieces together. You can start doing that acknowledgement to country to the right people. And I know in some areas it gets really confusing because of the traditional owner groups. There might be 3 in a particular area. There could be more than that in some areas, and we understand that. It's about being respectful and making sure you're trying to do the right thing. The next thing is to try and reach out and see if there is any Aboriginal organisations in that area.
Yeah.
And just asking. And again, we are relationship-based people, so you may not get an answer straight away. Be persistent. keep trying. Just because you may not have had a response doesn't mean it's a no.
So, Bindi, what do you think are some of the barriers that early childhood educators might have in teaching Aboriginal kids that are in the classroom?
Definitely cultural law and protocols. You know, there's things that they're just not going to be able to teach them. And also, there's probably some apprehension from the parents of a non-Aboriginal person teaching our mob. Basically, they're it.
Yeah. Do you think that what have been some bad practices that you might have heard of that early childhood educators have done?
You're wanting to open that can of worms.
Yeah.
Definitely, you know, educators going out there and teaching our children things that they've heard or been taught and not verifying the information that they're passing on. And, you know, kudos to the ones who are trying, but you need to verify the information that you're passing on, because we need to remember these children are going to grow up and think, hey, this is what I was taught, and yet it's not actually the truth. So, you know, we do want that right history being put out there.
Do you think that some educators are getting it right, or do you think the majority are still struggling?
No, I'm sure there's a lot of them out there getting it right, because, you know, if they're doing the right thing and researching the information that they have from Aboriginal people and the information is authentic, then, you know, kudos to them for trying, and hopefully they're doing it right. They're being respectful in any information that they're passing on, and they have the approval to pass it on. Mostly, you know, just because you see it online, it doesn't mean that it's yours to take and run with. And you do have to, you know, speak to those elders and get that permission to do it.
Yeah. What barriers do you think that some educators might have when they try to consult with community?
I think from the community, there'll be a lot of apprehension as to, or, you know, mistrust in non-Aboriginal people because of our history and meetings with governments and, you know, other non-Aboriginal people. They're not going to initially trust this person. So they do need to build up their rapport and put faith back in the elders as to what they're doing with the information, how they intend on using it, and how they'll do it. It needs to be respectful. But so definitely the barrier at the beginning is going to be the mistrust, but they need to do the legwork in building that rapport with our mob.
Yeah. I've heard some organisations go, oh, let's name all our rooms in a local language. What would be the process they should be going through to do that before they just start putting labels up on the rooms?
Yeah, well, for example, if it was Yorta Yorta country, I would expect them to first speak to the Yorta Yorta Nation organisation, maybe have some consultation with some of the elders, you know, not just go ahead and talk to one Yorta Yorta person and think, hey, I've got permission. That's not how it works. Even me as a Yorta Yorta person, if I want to do something that includes language, I'm not going to talk to one or two people. I'm going to talk to a few, in particular my elders. But, you know, definitely reach out to whatever country you're on, that organisation that, you know, that like Yorta Yorta Nation, reach out to that nation and seek that permission.
So, Nicole, what do you believe are some barriers that early childhood educators who are trying to incorporate First Nations perspectives into the curriculum, what are some of the barriers?
AJ, I think one of the biggest barriers that I hear is we haven't heard back from we're trying to get in touch with an elder. How can we do that? That would have to be the most common question I hear or asked of myself. And my response to that is, apart from the fact that there are not many elders, but B, why have you stopped? Why is that the start of your journey? So the biggest barrier is that I think people in their head decide, well, we need to make a connection with an Aboriginal person, and ideally they are assuming that's going to be an elder. And when that doesn't go their way, they haven't done anything and their journey has stopped. So the biggest barrier is that you need to do the groundwork first. And there aren't many elders, so therefore, why would they, even if they were available, come and spend time with you when you haven't actually delved deep and worked on your knowledge building individually and as a collective team? So I think the flipping the script is what needs to happen. You do the hard work first, and then you deserve to try and make contact.
Yeah. And is it just elders that people should be looking for? Or?
No, absolutely not. I feel that's what people often are seeking. But the educators that I'm working with, I say there are so many opportunities for you to engage with local groups, and Aboriginal people are so generous with their time. And whenever I'm working in an area we look up together, local municipality, are there any network groups? Quite often there is absolutely meeting places where I can say, if you have a look here, there is an Aboriginal meeting place here and here on this day. They meet regularly. You contact this person, and then you can start joining in those meetings as well. So I said, you don't need to always look for an elder. You're looking at connection with community, and you need to be creative in what that looks like and what that can look like within your contextual area, your local environment, and abroad as well. You've got Reconciliation Victoria, you've got Reconciliation Australia, you've got all these other amazing organisations as well. You've got them as your broader contacts, but then you do the hard work in your local area and see what's available.
Yeah, cool. What do you think are some barriers for early childhood educators in teaching Aboriginal kids?
I think that the biggest barrier would probably be that individual educators haven't done their unlearning. Particularly if they have grown up in the Australian education system that's had a strong colonised lens. So I think that the biggest barrier in working with Aboriginal children for educators is that they haven't done their own journey of self-discovery to see where they are and what they know and what they need to unlearn and relearn, so then they can feel more comfortable and confident in communicating authentically and respectfully and working with children and their families. So I think that's probably the biggest barrier. If you haven't started on your own knowledge journey, you're not going to be as confident in working with Aboriginal children as you could be.
Yeah, and that takes me on to the next question, which was, what are some of the ways in which early childhood educators could start this journey?
I think, well, I am going to say it again. I think watching webinar, I always say watch webinar 9 of the AGECS webinars. I think that's a great starting point. And then I think you need to work out be really honest with yourself and work out what you do know, and be brave enough to say, do you know what, I know for many people, they don't know necessarily what the meaning is behind the flags. So, and I think the best way is to, I'm going to go back to that audit your space, look around and critically reflect. Have you got symbols and signage up where you yourself or any of your team members don't actually know the true meaning of what they represent? So I think doing your own cultural assessment on yourself and your collective team to work out where your gaps are, and be brave enough to say, hey, I don't know what that is, or I'm not sure of that. I know I was talking to someone recently, and I mentioned terra nullius, and they go, what's that? So I think we just need to get brave and work out what we don't know, so that we can tailor and target some professional development to build people's understanding. And that's okay. That's okay. You're better off saying I don't know, but I want to know, than choosing to remain, I guess, a little ignorant in the knowledge. The knowledge is out there. It's about tapping into it, I guess. What else do I think people could do? I think champion Aboriginal people and people that are doing great things, and look at, what they're doing and how you can then be an ally and stand up and say, hey, have you seen what this person's doing? Have you attended this? Have you read this? I think that's a really good starting point as well.
So what do you believe is the major barrier to early childhood educators incorporating Indigenous perspectives into curriculum?
I think most people will answer time and time again. People are running out of time, and at the moment, lots of people see early childhood in crisis, and people are trying to keep their head afloat. So there has to be a quip, there has to be child safe standards, and someone's trying to throw a rep at me. What are you talking about? It's too much. The workload is huge. And people that haven't started the journey about their understanding and knowledge about the true histories, I don't see the reason why is this important. So the biggest barrier is people's only just starting at their journey, and the workload is already far above them. They can't fit that in. Those two are the major barriers in my view.
Yeah. What do you think are the barriers for early childhood educators in teaching Aboriginal kids?
Yes, that's complex too. And unfortunately, you've addressed this in the previous webinars really well. And I'd recommend anyone to watch all of those, because that addresses those difficulties so well in finding the confidence to ask questions. Keep asking questions. That was a really good one that came out of it. So I think that getting the confidence, keeping asking questions and saying it's okay to make mistakes, because sometimes we do get it wrong. Another thing could be that people indeed haven't learned much, so they don't feel the necessity to bring these things into the classroom. So I think it's really important that we start pushing the learning and understanding is important, and then how can we do it in the classroom? There's so many resources that will help you, and then to just do it. And if you make a mistake, that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If you make a mistake, it's okay. I think people are scared to make the mistake, but you're saying it's okay to make that mistake.
Yes, it's okay. And we make mistakes in so many other areas of our early childhood teaching and practice. And it's okay to reflect on that and learn from it and ask, hey, I did this way. Is it okay or not okay? Hey, I've used this language. I didn't ask permission. Was it okay? Can I get permission to use these words that are local, and so on?
Yeah. Where or what are some of the ways in which early childhood educators could start their journey on knowing more about Indigenous ways of doing things that they could incorporate? And what did you do?
Yes, and again, I think it's that 100 ways of doing it, by actually finding resources like the Play School episode of the acknowledgement, the little cuz, what is little J? I keep getting the name wrong. It's a really good, you can just play an episode and learn together from it. You can put the songs on and learn where they're from. You can put books on, books read by Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, Storybox Library. Just using the resources and putting it on is part of the learning journey. But on top of that is learning and finding those documents like the Marong framework and the Walking Together one, the cultural protocols documents. Once you sift yourself through them, you get so many tips and ideas of how you could do things and how not to do things and what is a welcome compared to an acknowledgement. They're over and over in those documents. So I would definitely look at them. But then also just putting on music from Jessica Mauboy or Troy Daly or Gurumul and incorporating those, surrounding yourself. And that's what I did. I started buying a whole heap of books and just tried them out and using them. And I put on some music and I bought artwork and talked about the artwork. And talking about an acknowledgement with children and feeling and what do we feel like, what is the word custodian, and having those discussions. So by surrounding yourself with all these little activities, the conversations start and you start being more and more comfortable with what you're doing and having that confidence.
Thank you for that. I really like that. But I ask you a different question now. What would be something that you would recommend people not to do?
Not to do. There's one document out by the Department of Education with lots of product art. And that says you grab a child's hand and you paint an Aboriginal flag on there, and then that's doing Aboriginal. And there's doing all these product art things. And unfortunately, it's even from the Department of Education. And I cringe every time I see that document. And I cringe every time that someone feels they need to hold someone's hand and do that and make sure it stays on properly, because imagine if it smudges. And that goes very much against what in early childhood we want to do, process art and not product art. Yes, let's talk about the colors and let children feel what paint feels like on their hand, but how can they smudge it or not smudge it and so on, and have that whole process instead of having to create an art piece. So don't do product art and don't do Aboriginal product art, but focus on the process and the conversation that goes with it.
So, Alana, what are some of the barriers you believe early childhood educators have when trying to incorporate First Nations perspectives into curriculum?
I know this is probably confronting, but I think white privilege. I think that sometimes we can't, getting our own blinkers off, and also misinformation. Because, see, I was educated decades ago. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. I had no idea. And it was only when I started to teach at TAFE in Wodonga, we had a cultural awareness day. It was the first time I learned about the stolen generation. That was about 30 years ago. And I was just stunned. So, yeah, I think ignorance, and I don't think it's necessarily anyone's fault or anything as far as individuals go, but I think it is our responsibility as soon as we get it's suggested to us that we don't know what we don't know. It's our responsibility to then start finding out, start reaching out and finding out. It's not hard these days. It's a lot easier these days than it was. You could be going around chasing your tail even 7 years ago. But yeah, I think that the ignorance is and then there's and for some people it is getting out of their own way. Just the other thing I'd have to say is that, see, in early childhood education as the teachers, we are encouraged to be very individualistic, to be very proactive, to be very, we lead the project, we get out there. And if you want to learn about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and you want to make a personal connection from the heart, you need to be able to completely flip that over and stop and be quiet, listen from the heart. That's one thing that a beautiful Aboriginal kindergarten teacher in Mooroopna taught me, listen from the heart. So it's just about getting the information here. It's got to be the heart as well. And So what
about barriers that early childhood educators have themselves in terms of teaching Aboriginal kids?
I think it's off the back of what I've just said, but it's another step further that, and even I know when I've discussed this with people, when I've been doing inclusion support, is they're trying to nut out what to do about this. Oh, how can I do the right thing about this family? And my question is, have you asked them?
Mm.
So going to the family, or maybe there might be one member, it might not be always the family, maybe they're not in a space that they want to be able to share, but is there someone who's working with the family that you can find out another way in? There might be an auntie, there might be someone else, and we found that really helpful. So that's from my experience what I've found. I'm sure there's probably a zillion barriers, but that's a standout for me.
Alex, what do you believe are some of the major barriers to early childhood educators incorporating First Nations perspectives into curriculum?
So I think, unfortunately, and it shouldn't be one of the barriers, but it absolutely is cost. It is expensive a lot of the time. Or sorry, it's not that it's expensive, it is expensive, but I think it's that people go, oh, well, we can't afford these resources or we can't afford this PD, and that's the barrier. Whereas there's lots of ways that you can embed and incorporate without having to spend money, but that's not necessarily how people think and feel. They go, oh, we can't afford it, so we can't do it. And I just think that's such a shame. I understand how it happens, but it is such a shame because it's not actually accurate.
What do you think are the barriers for early childhood educators in teaching Aboriginal kids?
I mean, there's a few. I'd say one of the major factors is probably fear. So just this fear of doing something wrong, especially if you're the type of person that's already hyper aware of sort of the injustices that have happened to, you know, First Nations families in the past and currently, you're also probably more likely to be hyper aware of how something you say or do could be misconstrued or could cause harm. And it often stops us from doing things that we'd otherwise do. I think one of the things that I've learned actually from participating in the whole reconciliation seminar series is that you're much better off doing something and stuffing it up and owning it and apologizing, or you might not even need to do that. You might just be, you might just make a mistake, go, oh, that was not the right thing to do. But you're at least learning from that and you're at least showing families that it's important to you and that you're trying. Whereas the alternative is you're too scared to do anything, you don't do anything, and that family sees someone who is not doing anything to reach out to them. And I just think, which one's better? Someone who's trying and not succeeding, or someone who's doing nothing at all? And it's always the person who's trying.
I think that's a really good point. I think that people are scared to try and they're also scared to fail. And I like how you just said that it's okay to try and it's okay to fail as long as you own it and move on. Yeah. So what are some ways in which early childhood educators could start their learning journey?
So one of the things that I've done, and I found it really useful, and I think everyone should do it if they're active on social media, is to find and follow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander creators and activists, because then you're just kind of passively learning every day, because you'll just read something, it'll ruminate back there, and it just slowly builds this knowledge that you have that then helps you make, you know, decisions about embedding perspectives in the future. So yeah, my advice would be find activists, find creators, find performers, follow them on social media, and before you know it, you'll just have a pretty big repertoire of ideas even.
Do you have any recommendations?
It's going to sound really weird, but one of the recommendations I have is actually a social enterprise. They're a clothing company called Clothing the Gaps. And through them, I have been introduced to ideas that I hadn't thought of, but also linked in with community events that are happening. They helped organize one of the rallies for Cassius, that really awful story from just, a few weeks ago at this point. But they're a social enterprise, and they buy and make clothing, and then, you know, the money from that clothing goes into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, charities and services. But yeah, they also share heaps of really interesting information, and also other activists who you can then sort of go, oh, I like this person, I'm going to follow them, and oh, they're really interesting, I'm going to follow them too.
So what do you believe are the major barriers to early childhood educators about incorporating First Nations perspectives into curriculum?
Yeah. We often hear early childhood professionals saying they're not sure where to start. Okay, that's easy enough. Do go to the Narragansett website. They also say they don't want to offend anyone. Now, oh gosh, I mean, I don't know how many times I've opened my mouth and I've put one foot in and had to swap feet. But I was told what I'd said was wrong, and that was fine. And that I've learned from that. So be willing to say something, but know that if you're told, then that is good, because then that person who's telling you knows that you can learn from this. The other barrier is that I feel that I understand is that for many Aboriginal families, they have strong sense of family within their communities, but when they come out into our white communities, that's a barrier because we're not as welcoming. And even though we think we're trying to be, we haven't asked them, how can I make this more welcoming for you?
What do you think are some of the barriers for early childhood educators in teaching Aboriginal kids?
There shouldn't be any barriers. I say that, and that's such a poor thing to say. There are barriers. There's this them and us, and I'm not sure why that should be, but they do. Some people can have that feeling that, well, I'm not sure what to do with the Aboriginal families. Such a wrong way to start. Go up, start chatting. Open your heart and say, look, this is new for me, and I apologise. I want to do this right. What can I do to help? That's probably the best way. Always be honest, and always never assume. Don't make assumptions. You're making an assumption from a person who's non-Aboriginal, and that is so wrong. Talk to Aboriginal families and ask them what would work for them.
And what are some ways in which early childhood educators could start that journey in recognising what the barriers are and creating strategies to overcome them? Yeah,
big question. First thing is read the true histories, read the stories of, I think was it Tony Birch who wrote The White Girl? Amazing story, but so many emotions in there about how Aboriginal people were treated and how they had to sort of hide and they had to wait till they were given permission. Get a real understanding of what people have been through, and just know that you'll never come from that same position. You've always had the privilege, the white privilege. And strategies, I'm not sure. Every person's going to be different, and they're going to start differently. But if you start with respect. There's so much media out there that just wants to put on a show of wrong things about Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. Start with respect and really go and understand what Aboriginal people and not Torres Strait Islander people have been through, and then ask them, okay, what can I do? How can I help? Yeah, I remember when had some gorgeous Aboriginal children. Glenda Thorpe approached me and said, can the Aboriginal Health Centre bring their children? And I said, sure. And so we were talking about, I said, what would we want to do? And one of the children said, I want a big turtle. I said, no problems. we'll make a big turtle. I'm not sure how to do it. But he found all this big paper, and he said, just put them all together, and he was getting kids to put designs on them, and then he said, well, we have to have it round, and so we stuffed it up, and just ask. and, be willing to follow rather than, being leading.
So Sandra, what do you believe are some barriers that early childhood educators face when trying to incorporate First Nations perspectives into curriculum?
I think lack of confidence, being afraid that they're going to do something wrong, they're going to offend. I think that would probably be the biggest.
Yeah. Why do you think they might be offending people?
So I think they want to try so hard to do the right thing. And I think there's a lot of messages out there about don't do this and don't do that, and you can't do dot painting. And there's so many things out there that I think they're confused.
Yeah. So that's in terms of trying to embed it into the curriculum. What about any barriers that early childhood educators might have in teaching Aboriginal kids?
Well, again, I would think that they would be even more worried about doing the wrong thing. And that's where I think it goes back to the importance of family and connections, and how to be addressed, and, what do the family, what do they want, what's important to them, which is really no different to any other family. We want to know what's important for these families. But I think for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, we want their culture to be, we want their culture to be lived for that child. We want them to make connections with country and land and that sort of thing. So, and I guess for us, we don't always understand that connection. So I feel that it's very important to be able to connect with the family. And, it would be great if the family would feel comfortable enough to come in, spend time to show us what that connection feels like and looks like for that family. And I think it's building those relationships. And it's also your service. How welcoming is your service for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? What message is your service giving, even from the outside to coming in? What message is it giving to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families? Because if they don't feel comfortable and welcome, then they're not really going to want to be around. Yeah. So I think it all goes hand in hand.
Yeah. What are some ways in which early childhood educators could start that journey in being able to link curriculum to make changes?
Well, I think they need to do an acknowledgement of country.
Yeah.
I think that's important. I think every day an acknowledgement of country needs to be made. ABC has an acknowledgement of country. So for any services that aren't doing an acknowledgement of country and don't know where to start with an acknowledgement of country, ABC has an acknowledgement of country, the play school, ABC, and that has educator notes on it. And those educator notes are brilliant. So if you're not sure, ABC Play School has quite a bit on acknowledgement of country there's a couple of videos on there with educator notes. So that's a really good, really good place to start. Obviously, your RAP, a reconciliation action plan, is a must, I think, for all early childhood services, because without a RAP, there's not a lot of authenticity to what you're doing. And I think that you really need to engage in a reconciliation action plan. And that's easy. You go on the Narragansett website and it seems daunting when you first go there, and I've been on quite a few reconciliation action plans now. But there's so much on Narragansett website. You know, you've got great resources, you've got professional learning, curriculum resources, and it makes it really easy. There's also, if you go on FKA website, you've got Possum Skin Pedagogy, and that was written by Dr. Sue Atkinson. Fabulous resource. Honestly, if people don't know where to start, it's a great, and it's Victorian. Yeah. So I really recommend that. And as I said before, just thinking about in your environments and play spaces, just thinking about the perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. You know, what can we put in these environments and play spaces that reflect contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander? And if you think like that, it just gets easier and easier.